Welcome. Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's event, Code Red, Unpacking the IPCC report. I know most of you are probably in some kind of lockdown, so solidarity, and I hope you're doing okay and you really appreciate this opportunity to connect. My name is Catherine McCallum. I am the Climate Justice Campaign Director here at GetUp, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm going to be your host for tonight. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm on Wurundjeri country, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and that sovereignty was never ceded. We know that the IPCC report has dropped a week ago and that there are 3,949 pages to unpack. So no doubt you have questions. How bad is it? How long have we got? What are the big opportunities for action? What about methane gas? And how do we tackle this? So that's why we thought it was really important to come together and process the information that we're receiving and understand how, as a community, we can confront it, we can understand it, and we can take action together. So if you're feeling angry or confused or numb or actually determined and fired up, then you're in the right place, and welcome. After the open letter, we did publish that in the Australian Financial Review on the day the report dropped, and this had also appeared in newspapers all across the country with our allies, with the 55 groups signed on. And this ad was funded by GetUp members. So thank you so much. We were overwhelmed by the support that you gave us to publish this. So I am now going to introduce our first speaker. So Professor Will Steffen is a climate change expert, a researcher at the Australian National University in Canberra. So huge welcome, Will, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
And welcome to all of you. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal Ngambri country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and also acknowledge the stewardship that Indigenous people have carried out over this continent for at least 65,000 years. And of course, I'll be talking about how we white fellas have mucked it up in only a century or two. Anyway, so what I'll try to do is unpack the main findings of the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, Working Group 1, which is on the basic science. Just to give you an idea of what actually goes into this, the team of scientists that wrote it, over 200, there were over 14,000 individual papers in the peer-reviewed literature that they had to assess. And they went through some pretty exhaustive rounds. I've been through these myself, of expert and government review. And they had to respond to 78,000 technical queries throughout this review process. Well, the first thing people talk about is what's happening to global average temperature. And that's the metric that a lot of people use as a good indicator for the state of the climate system. For now, focus on that right-hand panel. And you can see the black wavy line as the observed change since 1850, when we had reliable records. And you can see over the last half century, since about 1970, an extraordinarily fast increase, accelerating increase in global average temperature. Well, just in a capsule, here are the four main findings that I would take away from this report. One is the scale and pace at which we are changing the climate system has almost no precedent, and I'll return to that too. It's not just temperature, it's melting ice sheets, acidifying oceans, shifting rainfall zones, rising sea levels. What's happening now is virtually unprecedented in the 4.5 billion year history of Earth. The impacts that we're feeling are not only getting worse, they're actually accelerating. In other words, the rate at which they are occurring is itself increasing. That includes heat waves, both above ground, on land, and under the water, bad fire weather, storms, heavy rainfall, droughts, you name it, they're getting worse. These are measured over the last decade, is about 2/3 of that caused by CO2. So although we focus a lot on CO2, and there's a reason for that, because that's a very, very long-lived gas in the atmosphere over many, many millennia. But in the short term, methane is exceptionally important, and it's becoming more important. Well, what's driving those emissions? Well, there are basically two primary sectors that do that. One is agriculture, and it comes mainly from cattle production, but also from wet rice production. Those are the two major processes in the agricultural sector which emit methane. But increasingly, fossil fuels are increasingly releasing methane to the atmosphere, primarily through a big expansion of the gas industry, where we get fugitive emissions and also leakage, particularly in countries like Russia, which do not have very good infrastructure. And as the gas industry expands, methane emissions are also expanding. All right, let's look at Australia now. What is predicted for Australia out to mid-century and is pretty much baked into the system? Well, we're pretty used to heat waves, but they're going to become even more frequent and more intense. And that's both on land, the ones that we humans experience, but also there will be increases in marine heat waves and at the same time ocean acidity. Ocean acidity increases because about 25% of our CO2 emissions are dissolved in the ocean. And that creates carbonic acid, which increases the acidity. Both of these are hammering the Great Barrier Reef. So there is no doubt whatsoever that there will be further mass bleaching events on the reef. And in my view, I think we'll be extremely fortunate to have even remnants of the reef left by 2040 or 2050. That's the result of past inaction here and around the rest of the world. So we will have to prepare for these and deal with these. But as I said before, it's absolutely essential that to stop these trends, to slow these trends, and to stabilize them in the second half of the century, we have to act now. We can't wait till 2050 to get going on this. Well, what do we need to do globally? Well, first of all, and I emphasize this as the absolutely most important thing we must do, is that we cannot have any new fossil fuel developments of any kind. That's no coal, no oil, or no gas. So forget about a gas-led recovery. That's just crap. We have to stop all new fossil fuel developments. And then we have to phase out the existing ones as fast as we can. Globally, we need to hit at least a 50% emission reduction by 2030. And that's on a 2005 baseline. So we reckon we can and we should do better here in Australia, given our enormous renewable resources, technological capability, and the fact that we've actually been a laggard up to now. We have to do some catching up. So for us, just like the rest of the world, no new coal, oil, or gas developments. And again, that means no gas-led recovery. We really should aim for a 75% emission reduction by 2030 on 2005 baseline. That's a huge ask. It's a big challenge, no doubt about it. But we have enormous potential to do this via renewable resources and using those to electrify other sectors of the economy. Technologically, we can do it. But it's going to take an enormous effort. The decisions we make now will be the difference between a longer-term livable future for the young people or a future that is incompatible with well-functioning human societies. And the point we keep hammering is that every choice we make now, every fraction of a degree that we can avoid warming is actually important. It makes a difference in terms of lives, livelihoods, species, ecosystems saved. And if we want to have a future for our children and grandchildren, then strong action now is required. So the really strong message coming out of this report is this probably is our last really reasonable chance to get the climate system back under some semblance of control. And I end my talks with an extremely clear and simple message. When we look at where our planet's going, how we're driving change to the planet, there is no doubt in the scientific community's mind, we are now at the fork of the road. It's not in 2030, it's now. So we have to act now if we want to have a chance of getting this under control. So that means the number one thing we need to focus on now is stopping the so-called gas-led recovery and also stopping the export of coal. I should mention one thing that I'm involved in are a number of court cases where young people are taking action and we've had some successes and I've got another 3 or 4 in the works now. So I think anything we can do, whether it's demonstrations, writing to MPs, court cases, we need to stop the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. That has to be done. Anything else, if we don't do that, isn't going to matter. We've got to stop that. So that's what I would focus all our attention on now. We here in the ACT are 100% renewable now, and we rolled that out in 9 years and under budget. So there are a lot of economic gains now to be had by going renewable. The new future for energy is extremely bright. So there's nothing holding us back except vested interests and political ideologies. I talk a lot about tipping points. That's my area of research. But there are positive tipping points. There are social tipping points too. And we see it in other aspects in terms of gender issues, in terms of our relationship with our Indigenous colleagues. Things have changed enormously in 10 or 20 years. And they change fast because you cross a social tipping point. I think we can see a tipping point looming on the climate change issue. So anything that people do, even though you think it's small and not important, it actually is important. Tipping points are driven by multiple pressure points. There isn't going to be one big pressure point that's going to solve climate change. It's going to be multiple pressure points all throughout society. So whatever you can do is important, and it'll move us closer to that social tipping point.
Thank you so much, Will. We really, really appreciate your fearless advocacy and your science and the incredibly clear explanations that you've given us tonight. So, we've heard about the science from Professor Steffen, and Larissa is now going to talk about the front lines and what fracking means in communities on the ground, and tell you about the campaign to hold back this huge expansion of fossil fuel. So over to you, Larissa.
My name's Larissa. I have been working in the climate movement for a very long time. I think that, I hear those presentations by people like Will, and it just makes me fired up. At 1.5, we have to fight like hell for 1.5. It is not an option. I have a long history in my family working in the land rights movement. And, we don't call ourselves activists, but everything that we have within our community was set up by my elders and stuff like that. So for me, seeing those temperature variances and looking at those maps and being like, if we do nothing about this, climate change is going to mean the forced removal of country for so many First Nations people. We know that 60% of mining in this country happens next to or in close proximity to Aboriginal communities. So, while you might be living on the East Coast and having the benefits of all this mining, it is actually people on the ground in Aboriginal communities who are dealing with the frontline extraction. But also we need to reshape the conversation around what informed consent really means and what it's going to mean for our climate as well. And, I get the short of it is that when you have a conversation with Aboriginal people about what climate change actually is going to mean, it's one of the things that when you put that on the table, people are like, well, actually, we can't be doing this anymore. And but the way that we campaign now is to actually build relationships with communities. It's a big, what we call organizing. But actually, our strategy isn't just around stopping this fossil fuel project or working on this election, because we need to have some really transformative change in order to deal with the impacts of climate change that we've already locked in, but also looking at how we stop these fossil fuels. If the Beetaloo Basin is fracked, if just one gas field in the Beetaloo Basin goes ahead, we just said goodbye to any chance at 1.5. That's how important that frontline fight is in the Beetaloo Basin. And we know that in the Beetaloo Basin, doesn't matter what the government's saying, it doesn't make any sense. The methane in the gas that is coming out of the Beetaloo Basin is the most expensive gas in the world. The reason they want to frack it is because of the oil that's here. And we know that we need to stop burning all fossil fuels. So it doesn't matter, how much they're willing to line the pockets of their mates. We need to make sure that these projects don't go ahead. And, using coronavirus as a cover for gas-fired recovery, saying we need this thing, even though, economists, communities have come out for decades fighting against these projects. They don't want their water risked by it. They don't want their health risked. They've seen the disaster that's happened in Texas and Wyoming and Pennsylvania. Fracking has been a complete disaster. Shale gas fracking, which is what they want to do in the Northern Territory, is actually banned in a lot of states and territories in Australia and around the world. But I think people need to understand how actually land rights is a solution to the climate crisis. When people hear about land back, they think that there's a physical, we're going to send you back to wherever you came from, we're going to take our land back. But land back and land rights is a bigger conversation around autonomy. It's about making decisions. It's about putting our laws into Western laws. So our land rights and our ability to make decisions over land. That's one of the reasons why we are campaigning so hard to change the legislation around cultural heritage protection. Because at the moment, you see in New South Wales, in the last 10 years, over 700 applications have been made by traditional owner groups to stop industry and infrastructure. An incredible moment right now where we're really reckoning with what land rights actually means in this country. And that's why we need to look at, we can't just have the government coming out and saying, well, if you disagree with this mining project, then you're saying to Aboriginal people that they shouldn't have housing and health services. And it's like, no, we're not saying that. We're saying you should give that to Aboriginal people anyway. And you should also not hold them to ransom over their sacred country around it being destroyed in order to promise, you know, that some mining company is going to somewhere down the track materialize and pay for our health services. We shouldn't have to do this as First Peoples in this country. And so understanding how our fights are connected and really understanding that, you know, the climate movement is incredibly large in this country. Like, we know the union movement is really huge, but land rights and the land rights movement is separate, and we're different, and we need to build solidarity between the two of them.
So I'm going to hand over to you, Taryn, to talk about what next for the campaign and shifting the politics on this issue.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Catherine, and thank you so much to everyone for taking the time to dial in tonight. The latest date that the federal election can be is the 21st of May next year. And so during this period of time, we're seeing like a lot of mounting pressure on the Morrison government to increase their climate action, particularly given that not long ago, Australia's climate action was ranked worst in the entire world. We're still also the largest coal exporter in the world. So there's a lot of like international pressure. Our job collectively is to try and ramp up the pressure here at home. So if we work together with those 35,000 people who signed the open letter and the 55 alliance organisations that we're working with, we can mobilise at scale in massive numbers and use every single leverage point that's available to us. So the things that we're asking for is a fair and just national plan to slash coal and gas pollution this decade. We need to end public funding for coal and gas. We need to not frack the NT. We need 100% clean energy by 2030, and we need to clean up transport. That's both private and public transport.
We really have our work cut out over the next year, but we should also know that we don't carry the burden alone, that, you know, we're all part of this movement and we can all fill a niche that is unique. So I remember when I read my first IPCC report, I was pregnant with my first son. He is now 6'5" and he wants to be a basketballer. So I have been a climate activist for that whole time, and I am not tired. I am more energized than ever, and to work with you with all of the creativity and curiosity and collaborative work and compassion that we can muster. Thank you for your determination. Thank you for your presence, and together we will campaign on. Good night.